Okay, so you know that feeling, right? Like when you just see housing prices going up and up and up in your city.
Oh, yeah.
It's just making it harder and harder, for people to afford a decent place to live, or even just like young people or families that have been there for a while.
Yeah.
Or when you hear about, another delay in fixing our roads and bridges, like our infrastructure is just kind of crumbling around us.
Yeah.
Have you ever wondered why it feels so hard to actually make things better,
Yeah.
on these big important issues?
Yeah, it's like we have the resources, we have the know-how, but
We just can't seem to get it together.
we can't really make any headway on these problems that affect us every day.
Yeah, and that is exactly what we're going to be diving deep into today.
Okay.
We're looking at this new book called Abundance by two really interesting guys. Ezra Klein, who, is a really sharp political thinker.
Yeah.
He's got a New York Times column and a podcast. And Thompson, who's more focused on economics and technology. He's from The Atlantic.
Okay.
And he's got a podcast called Plain English.
Cool.
And their book Abundance was published just this past March, so March 2025.
Okay.
And it tackles this really, really central question.
Okay, what's that?
Why is it so hard to make progress on important projects in the U.S.?
Yeah, like why does it feel like things are moving so slowly?
Exactly, yeah. And they don't just stay super general about it, they actually get pretty specific.
Okay, so what do they focus on?
They look at these key areas, where it seems like things are just stuck.
Right.
Like the whole issue of housing, affordability, and availability.
Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah. And then there's infrastructure,
Right.
like our roads, bridges, all that stuff.
Fabulous.
And then, of course, the big one, climate change,
Yeah, of course.
which, it's just such a complex and urgent problem. And what I find really interesting about the book is the backgrounds of these two authors.
Yeah.
You've got Ezra Klein. He's got this deep understanding of politics and then how we got to where we are today historically.
Right.
And then you've got Thompson, who's always thinking about societal trends through this lens of economics and technology.
Yeah, like how those forces shape the world.
Exactly. Yeah. And coming from the New York Times and the Atlantic, these are really respected publications.
Yeah, they are.
So, it seems like they're coming at this with a really well-rounded perspective.
Yeah, I mean, their different areas of expertise could help them see different sides of the problem,
Right.
like connections that someone from just one field might miss.
Totally. And so today, our mission is to really dig into the core arguments of abundance.
Okay.
Figure out what they're saying about the root causes of this slow progress that we're experiencing.
Yeah.
And then also, we want to look at how the book's been received.
Okay, so like the reviews, the criticism.
Yeah. So let's start by unpacking their central argument.
Okay.
What's the main diagnosis according to Abundance?
Well, the core of their argument is this idea of an abundance agenda.
An abundance agenda. Okay.
Yeah, and their thesis is basically that a lot of our well-intentioned regulations, especially in liberal cities, they've actually become big obstacles to building and developing.
So it's not like the usual suspects that we think of
Oh, not really.
when we talk about what's blocking progress.
They're saying that in a lot of cases, it's not like overt opposition from conservative forces or anything like that.
Okay.
It's more that progressive policies, like zoning laws, which basically determine, what can be built where,
Right.
how big it can be, how dense, they've been kind of co-opted by powerful interests,
Oh, interesting.
often wealthier interests, to prevent new construction.
So they're using these progressive policies to keep things the way they are.
Yeah, to maintain the status quo.
That's fascinating and kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Like the rules that were meant to protect communities are now blocking growth and affordability.
Exactly. And that's where the abundance agenda comes in.
Okay.
It's not about getting rid of all regulations.
Right.
It's about being smarter about the trade-offs between regulation and the goal of improving society. They're calling for what they call a liberalism that builds.
A liberalism that builds.
Yeah, and the Simon & Schuster page describes it as a once-in-a-generation paradigm-shifting call to renew a politics of plenty, face up to the failures of liberal governance, and abandon the chosen scarcities that have deformed American life.
Wow, that's quite a statement.
It is.
And it really challenges the idea that scarcity is just inevitable.
Yeah, they're arguing that we don't have to accept this, that the problems we face today aren't necessarily the fault of some bad guys from the past,
Right.
but that the solutions of one generation can become the problems of the next.
Oh, that's interesting. Like the things that worked before might be holding us back now.
Exactly. Think about rules that were put in place decades ago. Maybe to protect the environment or preserve neighborhood character.
Yeah.
But now they're preventing us from doing things like building more densely to address housing shortages or deploying green energy projects to fight climate change.
Right. And Simon & Schuster gives a specific example of this.
Okay.
They talk about rules from the 1970s that are now actually obstacles to the kinds of things we need in the 2020s.
Wow.
Like urban density and green energy.
So it's like we're stuck in the past.
Yeah, in a way. And now here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
What has the initial response been to this core argument?
Well, the book's gotten a pretty mixed reception.
Okay.
There's been both strong support and some pretty significant criticism.
Interesting. So who are some of the people that are supporting it?
Well, Benjamin Wallacewell from The New Yorker, he called it a fair-minded book.
Okay.
That recognizes the trade-offs that come with redesigning government for dynamism.
So they're not just saying get rid of all regulations.
No, not at all.
Okay.
And then there's Henry Gribar from Slate. He praised the book for synthesizing good ideas.
Yeah.
And offering a vision of a liberalism that builds a can-do antidote to blue state malaise.
A can-do antidote to blue state malaise.
Yeah. And he also pointed out that there's surprisingly little criticism of the Republican-led administration in the book.
Oh, that's an interesting observation.
Yeah, some people might find that significant.
Definitely. Were there any other big names praising the book?
Oh yeah, David Brooks from the New York Times called it spectacular.
Wow.
He said it offers a comprehensive indictment of the current problems and a clear path forward, inspire hope, and enlarge the imagination.
That's high praise.
It is. And then there's Fareed Zakaria from CNN who called it a terrific book, powerful and persuasive.
Okay, so lots of influential voices are behind this.
Yeah, it seems like it.
But what about the other side? What about the critics?
Well, one of the more critical reviews came from Zephyr Teachout in Washington Monthly. She wasn't so happy with their focus on rolling back zoning, and she also questioned how detailed their proposed reforms were for institutions like the NIH and the NEPA.
Okay, so the National Institutes of Health and the National Environmental Policy Act.
Right, she felt like they lacked specifics.
And I can see how that would be a problem. It's hard to get behind an idea if you don't know exactly what it looks like in practice.
Exactly, and she also argued that their focus on a few large cities might lead them to underestimate the effects of monopolization on the broader U.S. economy.
Okay.
But her biggest worry, I think, was that the book's language was a bit ambiguous.
Okay.
And she was concerned that it could be used to justify broad deregulation.
Oh, so taken out of context and used to support something the authors didn't intend?
Yeah, she warned that it would be very easy to take their critique as a muffled call for deregulation writ large if they're not careful. The ambiguity could be used by big financial interests to make abundance a Bible for a Ronald Reagan-style deregulatory juggernaut.
So while the authors are advocating for a more effective liberal approach, some critics are worried it could be twisted into something else entirely.
Right, it highlights the need for clarity when you're talking about such big policy shifts.
Yeah, and how the same argument can be interpreted in very different ways by different people.
Exactly.
Now, Noah Smith also had a really interesting take on abundance on his blog, No Opinion.
Oh yeah, what did he say?
Well, he basically framed the book as a manifesto for something he called supply-side progressivism.
Supply-side progressivism, that's interesting.
Yeah, so the idea is that progressives should focus on increasing the supply of things people need and want.
Okay.
Like housing, clean energy.
As a way to achieve their goals rather than just focusing on redistribution or regulation.
Okay.
Smith argued that the left has kind of forgotten how to build.
Oh, wow.
Like they've lost sight of actually creating the things that people want and need.
That's a pretty provocative statement.
It is. What do you think are the key factors that Smith sees as motivating this renewed focus on building?
Well, he pointed to a few things.
Okay.
First, the housing shortage and the rise of the YMBY movement.
Right, yes. In my backyard.
Yeah, exactly, which is a direct response to the failures of more traditional approaches to development.
Okay, that makes sense.
And second, the lessons we learned from COVID.
Oh, yeah.
Especially those early struggles to get essential supplies.
Right.
Versus how quickly we were able to develop vaccines.
Yeah, that was amazing.
It was. And then there's the difficulty of going green. Like transitioning to a green energy economy.
Right.
Which is partly due to all these environmental regulations that slow things down.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then finally, Smith brought up the comparison with China.
Oh, yeah, like how much faster they could build infrastructure.
Exactly. And that's become a major theme in discussions about American competitiveness.
It has, for sure.
And so Klein and Thompson, as Smith interprets them, they're saying that progressives are often their own worst enemy.
Oh, wow. How so?
Through things like overly complex environmental laws or really time-consuming contracting requirements for government projects and this tendency to outsource instead of having the government directly do things.
So it's like the processes and structures that progressives have championed are now holding them back.
Exactly. And Smith emphasizes that the book is advocating for a shift away from these ideological debates.
Okay.
Like big government versus small government.
Right.
And towards a more pragmatic approach.
So focusing on results.
Yeah, like does it actually get built? Does it work?
And that probably resonates with a lot of people.
I think so, yeah. People are tired of the abstract debate.
They want to see actual improvements in their lives.
Exactly. Now, Samuel Moyn also reviewed Abundance for the New York Times.
Oh, yeah. What did he think?
Well, he acknowledged that the authors are really good at taking in information from all these different fields and synthesizing it.
Okay.
And he called the book a sharp cry against myopic Democrats who block new ideas and govern through checklists. So again, this idea that there are too many hurdles, too much bureaucracy.
Right. And the authors themselves talk about an endless catalog of rules and restraints
Wow.
that stifle progress.
And Moyn highlighted some specific policy proposals from the book.
Oh, like what?
Things like building more housing, reconsidering nuclear energy, exploring vertical farming.
Interesting.
And he noted that the authors argue that Democrats have basically traded novelty for NIMBYism progress for process and roaring growth for regulatory government.
Wow, that's a pretty strong statement.
It is.
And he uses this really striking example from the book
What's that?
about how much it costs to install an elevator.
Oh,
Apparently, it can cost 4 times as much in the U.S. as in Switzerland.
4 times? That's crazy.
I know, right? It's because of all these regulations and complexities.
Wow, so it really brings home the impact of all this red tape.
It does, but Moyn also had some criticisms.
Oh, okay, what were those?
Well, he suggested that the book might be a little too focused on the concerns of, like, elite finance and tech people who are mostly in big cities.
And that it might not fully account for the needs of other communities.
So like a question of whose priorities are being centered.
Exactly. And he also pointed out that the book doesn't really address the impact of neoliberal globalization on everyday consumers.
Right, and that's a huge factor in shaping our current economic landscape.
Totally. And Moyn ends his review with this really thought-provoking question about whether creativity and innovation are valuable in and of themselves or only if they lead to some kind of utopia.
Yeah.
What happens if the pace of innovation slows down?
So it's like questioning the whole idea of progress.
Yeah, and whether more is always better.
That's a deep question.
It is now Simon & Schuster also included a reading group guide with the book.
Oh, cool.
Which has a bunch of discussion questions, and some of them are really relevant to our conversation.
Like what?
Well, one question is about the distinction between ideological disagreement and what they call ideological collusion. And they ask why collusion is a more accurate way to understand our current political problems.
Interesting. So it's not just that people have different values.
Right.
It's that sometimes groups with opposing views might actually be working together to maintain certain conditions.
Exactly. And that's a really intriguing idea.
Yeah, like maybe both the left and the right are contributing to the problem in different ways.
Yeah. And another question is about their main thesis, which is that to have the future we want, we need to build more. And they ask why that statement might be controversial.
Well, it seems so straightforward.
I know, right?
Yeah.
But it makes you think about why our approaches to problem solving have become so complex.
Yeah, like maybe we've overcomplicated things.
And forgotten about the basic goal of actually building things that people need.
Right, like all the processes and regulations have become more important than the outcome.
Exactly. And the guide also encourages readers to think about the sources that Klein and Thompson use to make their arguments.
Okay.
Like, are they reliable? Are they biased?
Right, it's important to be critical of the evidence.
Yeah, and there's a question about their views on homelessness, which challenges some common assumptions.
Oh, how so?
Well, they question some traditional approaches to dealing with the problem
Interesting.
and suggest that we need to rethink our solutions.
Okay.
And then there's a question about zoning laws
Hmm.
and how they're used to preserve community character,
Okay.
which is interesting because it ties back into their main argument.
Right, about how regulations can have unintended consequences.
Exactly. And the guide also asks about this idea that the government is a plural posing as a singular.
What does that mean?
Well, it's basically saying that the government isn't one monolithic entity.
Right.
It's made up of all these different groups with different interests.
Okay.
And they often conflict with each other.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And it also questions the traditional big government versus small government divide, saying that it's more about sentiment than substance.
Like people's feelings rather than actual policy differences.
Exactly. And then there's a question about why they use housing as their main example.
Okay, why do they do that?
Well, I think it's because housing is such a fundamental need. And it's a really clear example of how these regulatory issues play out.
Right, like it affects so many people's lives.
Exactly. And the guide also encourages readers to think about technology companies and R&D from a historical perspective
Okay.
to understand how we got to where we are today.
Yeah, it's important to see the bigger picture.
And it also highlights the generational aspect of these problems.
Right.
Like how the solutions of one generation can become the burdens of the next.
Yeah, that's definitely happening now.
It is. And then the guide asks about where these conversations are happening and
Yeah.
who's being excluded.
Right, are we only hearing from certain voices?
Exactly. And it asks the listeners if they had any reservations about the author's arguments.
Okay.
Or if they've encountered different perspectives.
That's a good way to encourage critical thinking.
Yeah, and it also brings up the idea of choice and how we define crises.
Interesting.
Like who gets to decide what a crisis is
Right.
and whether individuals feel empowered in that process.
That's a really important point.
It is. And then finally, the guide asks listeners to think about how these problems affect their own lives
Okay.
and whether the book has changed their thinking.
So it's bringing it back to the personal level.
Yeah, making it relevant to everyone.
I like that.
So to wrap up our deep dive into abundance,
Mhm.
what do you think is the most important thing for our listeners to take away from this?
Well, I think the core takeaway is that abundance offers a really critical look at the things that are holding back progress in the U.S.
Okay.
And it focuses especially on how regulations and processes, often those created by progressives, can actually have negative consequences.
So it's not always about the usual suspects.
Not at all.
And what are Klein and Thompson proposing as a solution?
Well, they're calling for a shift towards politics of plenty.
A politics of plenty.
Yeah, one that prioritizes tangible outcomes, like building more housing, improving infrastructure, speeding up the transition to clean energy.
Okay.
And they argue that we need to move away from strict adherence to outdated or overly complex regulations.
It's like that old saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah, exactly, because we're so focused on making sure things are done perfectly, we end up not getting anything done at all.
And that brings us to our final thought for you today.
Okay.
As you think about the challenges we're facing,
Yeah.
what balance do you think we should strike between careful consideration and decisive action?
That's a tough one.
It is. And what does abundance really mean to you?
Yeah.
Does it go beyond just material wealth? Does
Right.
it include things like opportunity, innovation, maybe even something more than that?
Is it a purpose or fulfillment?
Exactly. And we really encourage you to consider whether the way we're doing things now is actually helping us create a more abundant future for everyone.
It's a question worth asking for sure.
It is.
Yeah.
And on that note, we'll wrap things up for today.
Great talking to you.
Yeah, you too. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Anytime.
And be sure to check out our next episode where we'll be exploring,
Can't wait.
see you then.
Bye.